You're entering Corsi Nation.
This is Jerome Corsi, and we have a really special guest today, my friend and co-author, who is Todd Calllender. Todd, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Jerry. It is a beautiful, in fact, it's a glorious Good Friday, so happy Easter to you.
Well, we're recording this just before Easter, and we'll be showing it on the Monday after Easter, and so therefore it's a glorious time, and we can celebrate our Lord Jesus Christ suffering and dying for our redemption today, and his rise on Easter, which is the high point, I believe, of the Christian year. He is risen.
He is risen.
Well, we are discussing today a very important project. Todd is an investment manager. We'll let him describe the nature of his position and what he's done with acquiring the rights here to a seaport that's going to be developed in Chile in South America. Now, this is a very important port. It is a deep water port, and it's strategically important. And I think what makes it extremely vital that we focus on this is that China has a Memorandum of Understanding in place to buy the rights to develop the port. Now, if China gets this, China is going to grab a key asset for Pacific shipping in Chile. This will be the really only deep water port that's developed, at least at this point, in South America,
Yes,
on the Pacific. And it will reduce dramatically by 15 days the shipping time to China. China now has to go through a port in Buenos Aires, up through the Panama Canal to get to the Pacific, and that adds 15 days to the cruise of their cargo ships. But even more importantly, this is a landing place for the Belt and Road Initiative of China in South America. Now, if we're interested in the Panama Canal and taking back the rights, and China, as you'll hear in the course of the discussion, already has rights to a port in Peru, the United States has a vital interest in getting involved here and making sure that Todd's offer to sell the rights to develop this port to the Trump administration are taken advantage of. So this is an extremely important conversation today, and one that we are going to be making sure is on Marco Rubio's desk within the next few days. We've begun taking steps to make sure that this is brought to top-of-mind awareness in the Trump administration. So, Todd, we've got a very interesting story today, and why don't you begin by explaining how you came to own these rights through your investment group?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying my role is Chief Executive Officer of an insurance group, and we deploy insurance reserves and investments in order to make claims, to make payments on claims into the future. We invest in all kinds of things all over the planet. We had an opportunity to acquire this piece of property. It's called Hacienda Castilla. I think we bought it something like 7 or 8 years ago. It's a great giant piece of property, 850 square miles of it in the Atacama region of Chile. And the person we bought it from, unfortunately, went into a bankruptcy situation, but had already started and had the foresight to understand that this great giant 8-kilometer long peninsula sticking out into the Pacific Ocean acted as a natural breakwater to both the wind and the current coming from the south. It's a geological anomaly because, unlike other such peninsulas, this has deep water on the lee side of it. So shipping is always a problem to dock or to moor when there are strong winds and currents. And this 8-kilometer peninsula is saving enormous amounts of money to dredge to allow ships to come in. It's so big and so deep that we could actually accommodate China-Max-sized vessels, which are even bigger than the largest aircraft carriers in the American fleet, and can accommodate them dockside, which saved an enormous amount of time, energy, and money. The point of which is that this was a strategic investment for us. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Over time, we came to understand that this particular piece of property was pre-designated all the way back in 2013 as being China's landing pad in South America for their Belt and Road Initiative, which the IMF helped the Chinese make a constitutional amendment. They were the first investors in the fund. for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that seeks to create an autonomous belt all around the world. Autonomous meaning that goods and services people would be able to move without human drivers on boats, airplanes, trains, automobiles, as the case may be. And this was the vital trade link pre-designated in 2013 to be the means by which the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative would land in South America. Why? Because it so happens that the breadbasket of South America is just on the other side of the Andes Mountains. It so happens, as you described, that all of the grains, the food supply in South America goes out through the Atlantic ports, which sit in river basins, which means they're subject to silt. They refill, they dredge, they refill. So much that 100,000 metric ton, that's the kind of vessel that goes in there, can only take on half. So 50,000 metric tons of cargo for a boat that can accommodate 100,000 metric tons. It's horribly inefficient. They have to go either around South America, the Horn, or they've got to go through the Panama Canal. By landing on our property, they can access that food supply. It's a very short drive over the Andes. It's only a 3% grade. Any train could do that, and it saves 15 days sailing time. Why is that important? Because of spoilage, not just the cost of fuel, not just the cost of crews, but fresh produce, fresh grains, fresh food supply directly to the Asian market. And by the way, Jerry, China has 17% arable land. So they've got to get their food from outside of their country. And I didn't realize at the time when we made this acquisition, we'd end up in the middle of a trade war. And we are, because we came to understand in recent times, the Trump administration has pointed out that China controls 40 out of 42 ports in South America. They've got the continent locked up where they've already got their mineral supply. Effectively, all the copper goes to China. Lithium, ore, gold, it all goes straight to China right now through the Atlantic ports. And their hope is to acquire our property to build it out. At the same time, I understand there are elements of the U.S. government that would prefer to acquire it themselves, and we're right in the middle of it.
Well, with one move, President Trump can block this final step of the expansion of China's Belt and Road Initiative in South America, which really is designed to circle the globe. I mean, China has in mind that around the globe, all things can pass and move and trade and world trade through
And
Chinese and military, through China-owned roads, ports, the whole infrastructure of transportation, which China's building globally. And if this one port is seized by China, that's going to give China a lock on the southern part of South America. It's really a unique piece of land in that, also the getting into Argentina across the Andes, just so happens there's these two mountain passes which will allow the transportation of goods, food, grain, other kinds of exports from Argentina, right? Minerals through these passes to this port. The port is the CopiaPort E, COPIA port, all one word, CopiaPort -E. And this 8-kilometer long natural breakwater peninsula, it forms a perfect deep water harbor that again accommodates China's largest cargo ships. Now, you have essentially through your Cotswold Group of investment group, which is the insurance investment group, and also ownership through an insurance entity that's partly indigenous owned. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a group of 7 different insurance companies, and this particular investment is ultimately held by the Chiricahua Apache Nation as the shareholders of that insurance entity that owns all of this property. And it's very interesting to watch the play between the local indigenous in Chile and, of course, our indigenous owners, which is fascinating by purpose of the United Nations Declaration of Rights on Indigenous Persons. So the interesting part here, Jerry, is that there are states with regulatory environments, and we've spent something like 7 or 8 years getting through an environmental application with the Chilean authorities. all of which is exhaustive. 15,000 pages of exhibits studying every possible impact you can imagine that such a port would have on the environment. And the last burden, the last regulatory hurdle in this application process was an indigenous consultation. We had to talk with the other Indians in the area. Of course, coming from an indigenous company, that was really a joy to do. But Chile respects the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Persons, otherwise known as the UN DRIP. They've made efforts to actually put that into pieces of law in Chile, so it's actually really beneficial to both them and to us. And of course, we love the fact that indigenous rights are growing around the world. The one thing I would say that I find fascinating about the Belt and Road Initiative is that, this was originally laid on the Silk Trail. It goes from Asia all the way to Europe, right through Ukraine. So here we see the Silk Road, the Belt Road Initiative is yet another means by which this trade war is expanded all the way into South America.
Yeah, and I think that the United States is just beginning to realize the importance of the geopolitics reconfiguration. I mean, if we're interested, the trade war begins with the Panama Canal, the trade war with China, because under Jimmy Carter,
that's right.
I pointed this out, Robert Pastor, who was a communist professor at American University, who had been favoring the Security and Prosperity Partnership in North America under George W. Bush. He wanted to formulate the North American Union, which was an effort George Bush envisioned to bring the United States, Mexico, and Canada into regulatory harmony, to create a trade union that ultimately would be a European Union, the same model being followed, a stealth creation of a regional government. We blocked that, of course. Phyllis Schlafly and I fought that very hard during the George W. Bush administration, but it was Robert Pastor's initiative to get Jimmy Carter to essentially give the Panama Canal back to Panama under communist notions that we were being colonialists. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt built the Panama Canal, and it has been vital to United States trade interests and our military interests, because certainly, passing through the Panama Canal was a way to get the Atlantic Fleet to the Pacific Fleet, vice versa, and both, especially in World War II. And it was vital that we have the Panama Canal in order to be able to run a global navy. With China controlling the Panama Canal, China is now in strategic control of the Panama Canal, and the Trump administration is taking active steps to get military control for the United States back over the Panama Canal. It would be tragic to let this port go to China in Chile and not understand its significance in terms of the Chinese plan for world domination, beginning through trade, but then ending up with military dual purposes to everything they do. Would you agree with that, Todd?
Yeah, I think you've got that exactly right. You could not understate the importance of transportation as it relates to trade. Getting goods and services around the world has always been a challenge, going back to the creation of mankind, so to speak, but also from the perspective of economies of scale. Right, there are things that the Chinese do, for example, manufacturing that the Chileans or the people in South America don't do. They've got mineral wealth, they've got food wealth, and that's the means by which trade and currencies are exchanged. And all of it boils down to the ability to perform on the contract. So if you have somebody in Asia that wants to buy limes from South America, if you can't get those limes to market, the contract's frustrated, everybody loses money. But if you can get them there before they spoil, performance goes up, trade quickens, the value proposition increases. And by the way, armies travel on their stomachs. Without food, you cannot power your nation. Your nation's power, its engine, is the people.
That's right. We've got a couple of videos, and I think, Chris, if we could show the first one on this Hacienda Castilla property, it would be good. People get a view of what it looks like. And we'll narrate it for those who are listening on the audio. But let's play this first video. And it begins.
The future is hungry, and South America will be able to feed it, thanks to CopiaPort E. CopiaPort E is an ultra-deep international shipping port capable of handling the largest ships on Earth. Port, capable of handling the largest ships on Earth. CopiaPort E is perfectly placed on a natural peninsula in an uninhabited region of Chile. Compared to Atlantic ports that take longer and require smaller vessels, CopiaPort E ships can hold 800% more cargo per load and save weeks on shipping time. A highly efficient way to get the most fresh food to Asia and beyond. With low-grade, high-capacity highways through the Andes Mountains, CopiaPort E can connect Argentina, Chile, and other South American producers with all of Asia. The future is brighter with CopiaPort E. For more information, visit CopiaPort-E.com.
It's a very good video. You get the visual impact of not only these gigantic China cargo ships, but the richness of this region and the access to Argentina, which is one of the food producers of South America. It's one of the grain resources of the world, and very, very fertile areas that can produce food that Asia and China desperately needs. But again, China will take this for its own purposes, both economic and military. And the United States, I think, is becoming aware of the importance again of hemisphere. I also want to put this in the context of the Trump administration saying we want Greenland to be part of the United States. So there's a real awareness in Donald Trump, which I think is brilliant, of the geopolitics reconfiguration. Greenland extends, of course, from Maine, above Maine, really by British Columbia, all the way up to the Arctic. It's a huge continent, and the thing about Greenland is its strategic importance. I mean, during World War II, when we were having to supply Great Britain by cargo ships taking food and supplies from the United States in these convoys to Great Britain, Hitler and Admiral Donitz figured out how the Wolf Pack could attack these and were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic through 1942. It really took it to 1943, and it came out of Greenland that we developed the air surveillance capability to protect these convoys deeper into the Atlantic. And then, of course, as World War II ended, we still have military bases in Greenland, which give us much greater access to the Soviet Union at that time in the beginning of the Cold War. And they now reach all the way up into the Arctic. And Russia is developing the Arctic. The Arctic is going to be militarized. And so I think President Trump has a hemisphere-wide comprehension. Why not get this port in Chile that will extend American reach if we can work out a deal with Greenland all the way from the Arctic to the Antarctic?
Yes, exactly right. I'm glad you said that. I hope you don't mind me jumping in, but as you're talking about that, Jerry, we saw in the last 5 years that Russia has expended sufficient revenues it doesn't have building icebreaker vessels, nuclear powered ones. They built 7. They're $1 billion each. 2 went to the Arctic. 5 went to the Antarctic. We are the last deep water port on the way to the Antarctic. So for staging purposes, also for purposes of launches of rockets into space, our property is equidistant from the equator to the south, as is Cape Canaveral to the north. So for reasons I don't fully understand, this is of strategic importance to launch geosynchronous satellites. Everybody seems to be focusing on the ship traffic is moving from north to south to Antarctica, and I don't know what it's all about, but all I can tell you is there's a lot of it. So I don't understand the implications here, but our nation, every industrialized one, has interest in Antarctica. On top of that, I imagine it's a function of time before we understand why that is.
Well, I mean, there's so much going on right now in space war. I mean, Trump also in his first term had the vision to create the Space Force.
Yes.
And when you take a look at the type of warfare that's going on right now in Ukraine, so much of it is being directed by satellites doing geopositioning and other targeting for drones and for any kind of really firepower. whether it's aircraft or missile or drone. We're dealing with an electronic battlefield right now, and that will be fought from space, to say nothing of weaponizing space with weapons that have not been fully disclosed to the American people or the world, that both China, Russia, and the United States were all pursuing, including these energy weapons from space, which are possibly in some ways going to have more impact than nuclear weapons in the future. I mean, our military is even talking already about being able to have explored bending space and time. And there's a lot going on that both the United States, I think all three, China and Russia, but especially Russia and the United States, recognize the importance geopolitically of the Arctic. The Arctic has a continent under it. It's much more of a, of a firm resource, but the Antarctic is equally important. And so therefore, we've got to start looking at the northern poles and southern poles as part of the Western Hemisphere configuration, going back even to the Monroe Doctrine, where President Monroe recognized the importance of the hemisphere. And so therefore, a port like this, strategically ignored, it would be a major, major failure of the American government to understand where the future is going, both economically and militarily. And
Yeah.
I think Todd, you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I do agree with that. It's funny that you actually require a UN license to go to Antarctica. I don't fully understand all the ramifications of that, but what I do see is it increasingly becoming militarized. There's a lot of military traffic in the South Pacific. As the further you go down, it's around there. If I were to guess, that's the next battlefield. As I understand it, there's tremendous resources. It's only a function of whether they'll be exploited or not. But our property happens to be the last place big ships could actually stage goods, services, fuel, etc. on the way down there. It's not very far. The other part that's really interesting about it that people may not understand is, despite the fact that it's on the southern continent, fairly good way down there, the water is warm. The water is about 70 degrees, the ocean temperature, because there's the Coriolis effect. In the northern hemisphere above the equator, if you flush your toilet, the water goes counterclockwise around, finally down through the bowl. It does just the opposite in South America. So effectively, we have the waters from the equator acting as a Gulf Stream, moving south right along the coast that keeps the water warm all year long. 70 degrees is certainly not going to freeze over. So it's a year-round operation. And the other part that was really interesting to come to find, we have some solar leases on the property. It turns out that our area on this earth is tied for the most efficient place on the planet to convert solar energy into electricity. We effectively have free electricity on our property right now. They can't sell it because it's so abundant. If you want to sell it, you have to do that at night when there's a demand for it. But other than that, you just plug it in and it works. So there's so many interesting attributes about this particular area in Region 3 of Chile's mineral wealth, obviously the solar wealth. Food is also completely, it's growable. I don't know, agronomy is something that can be done. Believe it or not, there's actually fresh water because the Andes are right there. And as you mentioned before, there's two mountain passes already with roads, highways going through them. And as of right now, there are trucks coming across from the Andes. They are bumper to bumper moving up the coast all the way into Panama. So it's really strange that we haven't had more interest from other parts of the world, especially when you think about Russia moving up and down the coast of the United States.
Well, I mean, and also Chile's. This is surprising when I did the research and realized that China is currently the world's largest producer and exporter of copper.
Yeah, that's right.
And
it all goes to China.
And they've had a enormous newly discovered lithium deposit in the same area as the port.
That's right.
So that China is now going to benefit from those resources if China gets a hold of the CopiaPort E property. And with all of the indigenous people, all of the environmental work that's done, this is being billed as an eco-port. In other words, the port is ecologically sound. Not only the solar energy, but all the steps that have been taken as a deep water port to make sure that the environment is protected in the creation and development of the port.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I, to their credit, the Chileans were most fastidious about the environmental process. Like I said, 15,000 pages of exhibits. I can't recall how many studies we had to undertake, but it was year round that we had to conclude these studies, taking into account the marine life in addition to the land life, the flora and the fauna. Believe it or not, there are actually lots of turtles and penguins and whales and all those kinds of things around. So we went to a lot of trouble to do this right and to plan it out right. And that's why it's called an eco port. I'm not what you call a big greenie kind of guy. I don't believe that there is man-made global warming, but what I do believe is that this earth is ours to maintain. We're the custodians of it. So we certainly seek to protect it the best we can.
Well, much of the environmentalism and certainly the climate warming hoax was not sound science, but the true environmentalists that we are stewards of the earth is important to continuously recognize, and this port will be consistent with those objectives. Now, Chris has just shown a couple of slides, one of which shows the trade routes coming up through the Atlantic that have to go through the Panama Canal compared to the directness of coming out of the Pacific ports and going right over to China. That slide is right there. And it's dramatic when you really realize the distances involved. People don't realize how enormous South America is. It's just a huge continent, and it stretches north to south, really from the Gulf of America all the way down to the Antarctic.
That's right.
It's huge expanse of territory.
And it's 13,000 kilometers from our port to Shanghai. It's less than 5,000 kilometers to the Antarctic. But if you were forced to take your ship all the way around the Horn or through the canal, you're adding on another 6,000 or so kilometers just in distance. But in terms of days, there are boats that wait for 3 months to go through the canal, one way or the other. And ships cannot always go through the Cape, the southern route around the tip of South America anyway, because it is hazardous and it is full of really bad weather. In fact, it's a ship graveyard. So a lot of times captains simply won't do that.
People don't realize that in the Panama Canal, it's not just that you're cutting through land to get through the Atlantic to the Pacific, but there's also a difference in elevation that has to be.
There is.
The Pacific and the Atlantic are not at the same level, so the ships have to go through locks which raise or lower them to go from one ocean to the other ocean. And Chris is showing you here some of the detailed diagrams and studies that have been done at this port. In the slideshow that we made available in the article we wrote on this in American Thinker, we have the slideshow included, and you can see just how much study has been done in this area, which is all now complete. So whomever purchases this can really start developing it almost immediately. Is that right, Todd?
Yeah, that's right. We're really looking to find a suitable partner to come into this thing. The reality is that it's $1 billion project, and we don't happen to have $1 billion laying around. So it's a function of finding somebody that has an interest like we do in the development of this to make it come to fruition after we've spent an enormous amount of money and time getting to this point. So our commitment is to see this thing through one way or another. That's what it was that we promised the Chilean government, and we intend to do that. My hope is that we can find a strategic partner to do this with that shares the same interest, the same ethics and moral compass that we do. I confess to you that I have lived and worked in 2 communist countries in my life, and I really despise communism. I think it's heartless, and I would like to see South America thrive. I really don't want to see it become another bastion of communism. So there is that Americana spirit in me that really wants to find an American partner to help build this out.
Well, I think we share that, and I think even the current government of Argentina is moving much more away from Peronism.
Yes.
the whole socialism that destroyed Argentina and was on the way to destroying the United States
That's right.
is just negative. It's just destructive. And having China get control of this port and putting its tentacles more deeply into South America could be a catastrophe over the next 100 or more years. Now, China, so Xi Jinping, the head of China, and went to the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro in November 2024, just a few months ago. And he met with the Peruvian president to open this new other port, which is called Chancay, Chancay, which is a $3.6 billion port in Peru, not nearly as good as the deep water port that we have in Chile, but China's giant shipping company, which is the China Ocean Shipping Company, or COSCO, COSCO, not the Costco that we know for it's a different Costco, but this has the same acronym, purchased a 60% stake in this Peruvian port just recently for $1.6 billion, which gives Costco the exclusive right to use the port for 60 years. Now, this is located about 50 miles north of Lima, and China plans to ship the Peruvian and Chilean lithium and copper through this port. And so China's already seized a port on the Pacific that will be of strategic interest to it. But again, if we can get the Panama Canal and we can get the this port in Chile, we'll have had north and south of China's port in Peru, we'll have U.S.-controlled assets for shipping and for military use.
Yeah,
now,
a balance of power, actually.
A balance of power.
Is critically important.
If we let China have complete control of these two major ports on the Pacific, and we don't have a port under our control in the Pacific, it's strategically going to be a tragic mistake for the United States to have made, even though Chile is not a major news topic to be covered in the United States. This has got to be raised to a very high level of public understanding.
Yeah.
Now,
to my understanding, Jerry, there are 40 out of 42 ports in total in South America that the Chinese already control. They effectively already control the South American continent, as they do Africa. Right? They've exported their people to all of these nations, and they have their allegiance back to the homeland. And it's really an interesting way of conducting imperialism through trade. Right? That's the bottom line, is they're sending their people to these continents to extract all of the wealth that they can, whether that's food or minerals or otherwise. It looks a lot like what I was doing in the early days in Eastern Europe. I lived in Poland, undoing the Soviet model economy. And it was almost predatory watching all these countries coming in and buying up the former Soviet assets. When you look at South America and you look at Africa, they are for sale. And you made a good point. Thank you for that. As it relates to Argentina, that President Milei seems to be going the correct way, but Venezuela and Colombia are now avowed communists. They have communist governments. You look at Brazil, Lula is moving towards communism. The entire continent is shifting towards the People's Republic of China's governance model, which is based on communism. And I hate to be, an alertist about it, but the last time we saw this was Korea and Southeast Asia, where American interests were fought for. And this is on our doorstep. This isn't the other side of the ocean. This is just to the south of us.
Well, China has acquired 129 port projects around the globe, and China conceptualizes the global south. In other words, China sees the Southern Hemisphere as theirs and having resource and being resource rich. Both for production of crops, various kinds of minerals, copper, lithium, rare earth minerals, but to conceptualize the global South and then to conceptualize the Western Hemisphere, China is engaging in a new form of geopolitics that I don't think the American people yet are aware of. We're used to thinking of the World War II and post-World War II configuration of Western Europe as central. Okay, and producing the World War II is largely fought over Western Europe and command and control of Western Europe. Of course, Hitler had global ambitions, but I think Hitler would easily have made a pact with Great Britain to go against Russia, and that had been going on since World War I. But the point is that Western Europe today is in decline. It's overrun with Muslims who have been immigrating from the Middle East. It's got massive cultural problems. The Muslims are not assimilating. The European Union has largely been a failure. The countries have gone off the ledge on this global warming, net zero. Germany is shutting down. It did shut down its nuclear power plants and is deindustrializing. So, Germany's on the verge of a major economic collapse. And you take a look at the European Union, I'm thinking it's going to essentially fall apart over the next few years.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
here you've got
right.
China positioning now to have major assets all through the global South and to control South America's shipping, which is major hold on South America, while the United States is asleep at the switch, or if not complicit and bought by China. Mitch McConnell, his wife Elaine Chao, with all their millions in China with her family, and Mitch McConnell going over to China being made a millionaire by the Chinese. That family in China would not continue to survive if Mitch McConnell hadn't been bought and sold. And
That's right.
say nothing of the Biden family and their relationship to China. It's actually fairly cheap for China to buy American politicians.
Yes. Yeah, it is. And you know what's amazing, Jerry, is people don't seem to understand that this is the end of the road. The rest of the Belt and Road has already been built.
It's already built.
So
And
this is the last. This is the last piece.
They're building all through Southeast Asia. They're building all through, they're tying India across.
That's right.
It is all the old silk trade routes that China had going back into the Middle Ages.
Marco Polo.
That's right.
What it is.
And China's never lost that vision. Now, Donald Trump is engaging, I think, brilliantly in a reimposing of the tariffs. And if China loses us shipping all the manufacturing to China, China's going to be in economic difficulty very quickly. And China also has the problem of feeding its population and needing to get imports in order to keep the population of China fed. And it's, the slave labor that China is relying upon is not particularly politically stable. The Chinese government is actually fairly fragile.
Yeah, that's right. I just saw that. If you don't mind, when you said that, it sparked something I saw, a notion I saw the other day. It was a Chinese man actually expressing himself in a very clear way, but to his government to inform them that they're crazy about the trade war that they're undertaking with the United States, in so much that there really isn't anybody else to trade with. He said, what are we going to do? Use rupees to trade? Are we going to use rubles? Are we going to use, there is no other means, right? And it's amazing to understand that the Chinese people want these tariffs dropped by the Chinese government. People don't understand it. All President Trump is doing is raising tariffs that never existed before against huge Chinese tariffs that are levied against U.S. goods. In fact, there are certain U.S. companies that can't even export to China. So it's been a one-way trade war for decades. And yet President Trump stands up and just, turn about being fair play, raises some tariffs. And the Chinese people see it for what it is, Jerry. I think you said it right. The Chinese government is in a very fragile situation.
Very fragile. And, I've been opposing this globalism and world trade, this free trade, its concept for a quarter century or more. It's not free trade. What it is us eliminating our tariffs, with other countries protecting themselves with tariffs against our goods. The value added tax in Europe imposes tremendous costs on a comparable automobile manufactured in the United States, sold in Europe, than compared to a European car sold in the United States, where we're not imposing similar taxes or tariffs.
That's exactly right.
And from the beginning, this whole free trade was anti-American. It was designed by people like Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a communist. It was designed to weaken the power of the United States and to boost the power of China largely and Russia. We let China in the World Trade Organization. We're going for the Security and Prosperity Partnership in North America. We're going to, at that time, under George W. Bush, build these deep water ports in Mexico. We're going to bring in Chinese containers to Mexico, intermodal transportation by rail up to Mexico into the United States on this massive superhighway, the Trans-Texas Corridor, that was going to terminate in a customs office in Kansas City that was owned by Mexico.
Wow.
And then we're going to put by truck these intermodal cargoes. We're going to go to warehouses to be sold in box stores. Now, I kept saying, great idea for the oligarchs who want to control and make themselves billionaires on international trade. But if the middle class loses our jobs in manufacturing, who's going to buy these goods? Well, they hadn't thought about that.
Isn't it interesting that on the 10th of January, 2023, Mr. Biden, Mr. Trudeau, and Obrador met in Mexico City, and they made the Declaration of North America, effectively erasing the borders between our nations. The following day, Alejandro Mayorkas, the head of Department of Homeland Security, welded open the gates. So I had no idea what you had said about Mexico having a customs office in the middle of the United States. But it makes perfect sense. This is all in furtherance of what it is Klaus Schwab and his gang of merry men, his gang of evil geniuses, were creating a one world government with China being the only surviving sovereign. Yeah. And everybody coming under it.
And so we're finally beginning now, and I think the gift of God that the 2020 election was stolen is everybody got to see how evil these people really are.
Yeah, that's right.
Mutilating our children sexually before they reach the age of puberty. So they'll never have an orgasm and they'll never procreate. Of course, these people are depopulationists, going back to Richard Nixon's time and Henry Kissinger doing a memo, the 1970s, making depopulation the official U.S. government policy, global depopulation. And so we're dealing with demons here. But what we're finding is with Donald Trump, and this is why I think it's so important to give the urgency to this port in Chile, is if Donald Trump wants to succeed in this mission of repositioning the United States as a military power and having an America First policy, we cannot afford to ignore this port that Todd is offering to sell to the United States, even though there's an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, in place with China. And so we're going to make an urgent effort to get the attention of the United States government, Marco Rubio, Hegseth is Secretary of Defense, and Donald Trump, that this port is available, but they need to act now, because with an MOU in place, it's just a matter of time until China is going to want to execute that MOU and own the port. Right, Todd?
Yeah, I think you framed it exactly right. It's we're in the last days here, Jerry, that the stakes are extraordinarily high. This is the last shoe to drop. It's the last domino to fall. If it isn't, concluded successfully with some other party to create that balance of power, that multinational interest, then I think the continent itself is actually gone.
Well, it's essential, again, from the military as well as the economic dimensions. But I've been fighting this since Dubai ports, when Dubai wanted to control the ports in North America, and George W. Bush was willing to sell the ports to, especially Long Beach in California, to Dubai to manage it. We blocked that. But we didn't stop the effort, because most of the U.S. ports right now are not under U.S. control. That's already happened. And I'll be writing about that here in the future to support the United States getting re-engaged in the importance, both in terms of economics and military strategy of controlling our ports and not letting foreign nations control our ports while we sit idly by, lose the jobs, lose the income, and let this world government, in a surreptitious way, stealth way, lying about it, undermine our assets, such as ports, before the American people realize what's happened. And so that's already well in progress with China having bought so many port interests. Of course, if China begins to suffer economic distress with Donald Trump taking manufacturing back to the United States, not buying so many cheap goods from China made by slave labor, demanding that we produce even our semiconductors here, our electronics here, bring manufacturing back to the United States, reinvestment back to the United States, we can turn this tide. The hour is late, but it's not over yet. And this port in Chile, the CopiaPort E, is a vital strategic resource that we believe the Trump administration cannot afford to ignore. So, Todd, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention so we can begin to make the American people aware of it. And thank you for your dedication to the United States, that you are making the effort to get this port known and sold to the Trump administration rather than being forced for economic reasons to make a deal with China, which you prefer not to do.
Thank you for having me, Jerry. It's really a joy to spend time with you. I appreciate your tremendous intellect and understanding world geopolitical perspectives in addition to the economic ones. It's really helpful to me, and I appreciate you giving me your time.
Well, it's a great honor to have you with us. You're a friend and a co-author. We've worked together. I look forward to many more years, God willing, of working together. And I look forward to being successful and getting CopiaPort E owned, operated, developed, managed by the United States of America.
Yeah, that's a noble ambition. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, God bless. And on going into recording the show on Good Friday, going into Easter, I want to celebrate the suffering of Jesus Christ for our redemption. We should get on our knees and be thankful, and then celebrate his conquest over evil, his affirmation of his godhood and rising from the dead. This is both the saddest time in Christianity and the most joyous time in Christianity. And I hope everyone can celebrate this with a spirit of God and a return, 2 Chronicles 7:14, of realizing we need to repent for letting the world get to the point where it is, and the need for us to do our part repenting. God will hear our prayer and heal our land. So we go into Easter with that resolve. This is Jerome Corsi with CorsiNation.com. We're doing podcasts every weekday. Thank you for joining us. God bless.